Welcome to the target stream for Mint Press News. I'm your host, Robert Inlakesh. As always, thank you to everyone for joining us. Just prior to us going live, Iran had opened fire on another tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, which the United States claims it fully controls and is open, while Yemen's Ansar carried out precision strikes on Saudi proxies, all as Israel escalated its bombing campaign in southern Lebanon. That's ongoing as we speak. Sectarian tensions are also boiling up once again in Syria. The airstrikes on Gaza do not stop. And new evidence has emerged of damage to, yet again, more US facilities that were previously covered up. But before we get into all of that, the target stream is 100% viewer funded. The last 2 years, we were financially targeted and banned by PayPal and had our fundraisers taken down by Indiegogo and GoFundMe. They even withheld our funds. And so we are looking for 300 new members to keep this news show alive. You can join Mint Press on Patreon or right here through our YouTube membership program. So that being said, as usual, we are again on the verge. We keep saying that here on this program, and things are indeed heating up. But of course, if you're following the Western corporate media, that's not what you are going to be hearing. You are not going to be informed at all about what's been going on with Yemen. And as we have covered in past live streams, the so-called Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, apparently doesn't know that Yemen is even involved in the regional war. But Trump is now making his latest demands, which has sent the price of oil shooting up once again. Seems to be a lot of manipulation has been going on of Brent crude futures, and that is what we call typically the price of oil. But the real price of oil, of course, is very different from that. But Trump has claimed that Iran's demands, which were put forth for actually opening the Strait of Hormuz, are not valid. Instead, he said that Iran has to compensate the families of what he claims are 52,000 protesters who were killed in 2 nights, according to Donald Trump. Those numbers started in the low tens of thousands. They went up to around 20-something thousand and 30-something thousand. Now we're at 52,000. I've heard him say before a little bit more than that, but we're resting at a solid 52,000 protesters now that he claims. But not just that, the hundreds of thousands of protesters, according to Donald Trump, that have been killed by Iran since 1979, which of course is nonsense, not even based on the anti-Iran propaganda outlets. They don't even claim stuff like that. I mean, there are some, crazy activists who claim stuff like this, but for the most part, that is not something that you'll even see reported by even any of these anti-Iran media outlets. He is simply just making stuff up. And of course, we'll start with this because when we're now on the topic of Donald Trump and him claiming that Iranians need to be compensated, and that not only that, but thousands of American families have to be compensated for roadside bombs that were planted by Iraqi groups, not Iranians, that killed, of course, US soldiers in where? In New Jersey? No, of course, they were killed in Iraq, right? And they blame the IRGC and the Iranian government for this, even though this is not direct at all. Even if some of these groups that were planting roadside bombs were, in fact, backed by the IRGC at some point, it's a ridiculous argument to make. Perhaps we'll get more into that later in the stream. But to start things off, there's been another story, and we're going to get into this because it is important to cover. So the Jerusalem Post, of course, propaganda rag outlet here for pro-Israel outlet, they say that a Basij singer was abducted, tortured to death by a group in Iran. And of course, they have their biased coverage of this here. But an Islamic singer and Quran reciter was taken captive by a group in Iran, which are accused of having or owing their loyalty to the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. There are a number of different claims about exactly who this group are, but the story, as it goes, is he was abducted, held for 2 weeks, tortured severely, and then this group that said that they took him and killed this guy, a civilian, they claimed that he is responsible for the deaths of these 52,000 now that Trump claims. Of course, different organizations claim all different ridiculous numbers, none of which can be substantiated, none of which have provided the names, none of which have been able to provide any photographic evidence, any satellite evidence, any video evidence, nothing like that to support their claims. Some claim that hundreds of thousands were injured. Well, this group, this crazy group of lunatics, kidnapped a civilian, held him in captivity for around 2 weeks, tortured him, and then cut his heart out of his chest while he was still alive, and videoed it, sent that video over to the family, and according to some reports, these are not substantiated, even mailed parts of his body to the family. That end bit, there is no evidence for, but that is according to some reports. But the rest of it, very much true. Now, these lunatics who walk around claiming that, 1 billion Iranians were killed in 15 seconds, and that Donald Trump's number is not substantiated by anything, really, nothing. We've gone for these numbers, where they come from, the organizations, their connections to Israel in some cases, and in most cases to the State Department, putting out all these contradictory numbers about the number of Iranians supposedly killed in the evil massacres that occurred at the start of the year. Well, these are some of the sort of people that support that narrative. And not only that, you might be surprised to know, but these ISIS-like tactics, it's the only thing we can really compare it to here, by secular people, people that are atheists in most cases. They claim to be affiliated with Zoroastrianism in some other cases, even though they don't know the first thing about Zoroastrianism. Most of these people went and did this horrible thing. And then we have people in the Persian diaspora who are supporters of the Shah celebrating this quite publicly. And a lot of that came out. So that's just to address Trump's ridiculous claims. That's the sort of stuff that happens, and that people like this group will justify their actions based upon if these stupid, ridiculous, irresponsible numbers and narratives are pushed. And of course, the corporate media are all about this. That being said, with Donald Trump and his nonsense, because Donald Trump has been claiming, of course, that the Strait of Hormuz is open, and we're getting more and more reports exposing how badly the US military has got its head kicked in during this conflict. And it's not looking good. This is the Wall Street Journal. They reported that $13 billion worth of damage has been caused to US military equipment alone. That's just equipment losses and damage to facilities alone. Now, we're not considering all of the other damage that has been done, and all of this has been kept under wraps. The United States clearly does not want to show the public what their actual losses are. We've seen various cases which were exposed during the war by the likes of The Intercept, of them removing casualties from their casualty count list, not offering a good enough explanation for why they did that. In some cases, not offering any explanation at all. More recently, they're not counting what they admit. This is the Pentagon's numbers. 270 US soldiers were injured and another 4 were killed. That's their numbers. They removed them from a list of Iran war casualties and created a separate list to claim that we're in a ceasefire period now, doing mental gymnastics in order to cover up their losses. Also, with that being said, new footage, satellite imagery has emerged. This is from Al-Hasaka in Syria. It's a US facility there. And at the time, there were denials that this had even happened. And as you're seeing, the satellite imagery speaks for itself. Now, we can't confirm how many US soldiers might have been killed or injured, or what the precise losses were here. And quite frankly, I don't expect them to ever release those numbers. But we heard lots of denials about what was happening in Syria, about US forces even based in Syria, how many of them were based there. But Iran did announce this ballistic missile attack during the war, and now we're getting more evidence of that coming forth. Also, this recently emerged too. This was in early March. There was an Iranian ballistic missile attack which targeted the Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi. At the time, all of the losses, according to the official sources, were because of debris from falling intercepted missiles and drones. But of course, now we have some satellite imagery, and it doesn't exactly just look like debris. So that looks like a hit to me, but maybe my senses are failing me here. Maybe it is simply debris that's caused this. And this is always the case, the United Arab Emirates, and this has been, debunked. Their claims, they'll give ridiculous numbers about how many Iranian ballistic missiles and drones were shot down. In one case, very embarrassing for the Emiratis, Dubai International Airport was targeted, and they claimed that the drones were shot down, nothing hit, everything's fine, back to normal. And then what appeared to be a foreign worker actually filmed the incident, and it's very clear that a drone did target US sites at the airport in Dubai. So with that being said, there are some other developments that we should also look at that have just occurred in the past hours. One of which is that a facility in Libya has caught fire. So this is in Zawiya, the area of Zawiya. It is a diesel tank, an oil depot that was, according to some sources, struck by a drone. We don't have 100% clarity on precisely what happened, but it does look like somewhat of a repeat of what may have happened in Egypt last week. So that's some footage that was filmed by locals in the area, and the fires are still raging on. They can't put them out. They've just tried to control them so they don't spread. The facility was put on lockdown. And of course, at this time, it's not really a great look, because with the prices of oil yet again rising and Donald Trump making new threats against Iran, the Strait of Hormuz being locked down, and of course, with Yemen imposing its counter blockade on Saudi Arabia, 25% more or less of the world's oil supplies have completely stopped. All Saudi exports to the United States came to a complete halt last month. That's now proven. The US strategic petroleum reserves are down to levels that are as low as they've been, at levels that we haven't seen since the early 1980s. Things are getting pretty tense. And as that is occurring, of course, and more information is coming out about what has happened, I'd like to also note, before getting on to the next point, which is Yemen and what's been occurring there, Iran has continued to strike bases and weapons depots in northern Iraq, which are belonging to these Kurdish opposition groups, Kurdish Iranian opposition groups, which operate out of northern Iraq. They've been striking them. There's a lot of footage that has, of course, emerged as well of the damage and the impacts which have been occurring in Iraqi territory. We do know from the Iranian military that special forces teams have been deployed on a number of occasions across the border to carry out operations against these groups, which Donald Trump was very openly talking about, trying to use them to invade Iranian territory. And there have been strikes that have been committed against Kuwaiti targets. The United States, which before said every single oil tanker which was hit, and of course, Iran has been striking tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. So some footage here. of this is the latest footage we have. There was another tanker fired upon earlier today, but this is from the weekend here. Again, all the footage that I'm showing here and will show in this video has come out since our last stream. But the United States had pledged previously that it would take out Iranian infrastructure like a bridge or a power plant or water desalination facilities for every single tanker targeted in the Strait of Hormuz. That has not happened. In fact, US targets continue to get hit, and the United States just doesn't even talk about it. CENTCOM, or as I like to call it, COPCOM, just doesn't even acknowledge it's happening. There's no acknowledgement whatsoever. And Trump is there claiming that the Strait of Hormuz is open. The reason why he's doing this is for the algorithms. It's for the AI systems, right, that are behind a lot of the trading, which keeps the price of oil low. So it's textbook market manipulation. That what's happening is there's these statements that come out from the US president, which are clearly untrue about the Strait of Hormuz being open, about the United States having control over the Strait of Hormuz. And then based upon these statements, the price of oil will go up and down, right? So when Trump comes out and declares something about the Strait of Hormuz, if he's declaring that he's going to respond to Iran or launched a number of strikes against Iranian military facilities in sovereign Iranian territory, then the price of oil shoots up, and he can play with this market. So that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at all of this, because it is important to consider. Also, Iran does seem to be preparing for the final round. What's recently happened is Mujtaba Khamenei, who replaced his father as the supreme leader of Iran, has issued directives, and he has officially juggled the leadership roles of the Iranian top Iranian military positions, and it appears as if what's happening now is that all of the leaders that Mujtaba Khamenei trusts and wants in positions going forward in the event of an escalation are being placed in those positions of power inside of Iran. That's getting some coverage today in the Western media, but not that much. And of course, you can expect very biased reporting about what is going on. That being said, there are new developments on the Yemen front. The first of which we're going to look at here, which was quite interesting, was that there was an attack that took place on oil facilities in an area called Jubail in Saudi Arabia. And Yemen's Ansar Allah actually claimed this attack on those facilities, very effective attacks. This came almost immediately after, or very soon after, factions within Iraq and what's known as the Islamic resistance of Iraq announced that they would postpone their retaliation that was supposed to occur starting a few days ago to Saudi-US dual strikes on Iraqi targets of the PMU, and some civilian targets were also hit as well in the midst of this bombing campaign that occurred across Iraqi territory. Now, this enraged a lot of people because they wanted to see an Iraqi response, and perhaps we'll get a little bit more into that dynamic and why that hasn't happened. But it's my suspicion that it could be that Yemen's Ansar Allah claimed this, but it was carried out by an Iraqi group. That's a suspicion that I have on this. Now, obviously, we don't know whether that is the case or not, but that it very much could be the case that an Iraqi group did commit this, because there are a range of different Iraqi armed factions, not just those who are affiliated with and are the original popular mobilization units inside of the country. The Iraqi government is now being pressured, like the Lebanese government is, to disarm their resistance factions. And there is suspicion that the Iraqi government itself collaborated with the United States and Saudi Arabia to strike positions in their own country. So there is a complex situation there for the armed groups which are operating in Iraqi territory. Also bear in mind that Iranians were killed in these US-Saudi strikes that took place. And it's, these groups in Iraq of the Popular Mobilization Units were created originally by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, or with the help of them. And so they are very much aligned. There could be a number of different calculations that go into why they haven't immediately responded. But of course, that's something perhaps for another day. What we've seen more recently is that Yemen's Ansar Allah have been firing on targets. They haven't stopped for 5 days, firing ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, targeting the Saudi proxies inside of Yemen's territory. This is a strike here that you're seeing from Marib in Yemen. And the amount of casualties that they're admitting, it's suspected that there might be larger number of casualties that occurred as a result of Yemen's strikes. And Yemen has, of course, the Ansar Allah-led government, the Yemeni armed forces, have released footage. So we're going to take a look at that here of their strikes. So here are some of the ballistic missiles. Let's zoom this forward a little bit. That are being fired at the positions of the Saudi-backed forces inside the country. And we've also seen from the videos that have emerged the aftermath of some of these strikes that weapons depots appear to have been struck, that around above 100 fighters belonging to the Saudi proxy groups have been killed. And these drone and missile strikes are targeting a whole range of different military targets. And this has really come as a major shock because there was a mobilization, and there has been a mobilization of these Saudi-backed forces. And they had hoped to launch some kind of an offensive against Ansar Allah in the near future. In fact, when the Trump administration launched their so-called Operation Rough Riders against Yemen, and they bombed Yemen for around a month and a half, wasted billions of their taxpayers' dollars doing this. And when that occurred, they had attempted, the United States, there were a lot of reports that they were attempting to get these Saudi proxy forces and what was at the time the Sovereign Transitional Council aligned militant groups, the STC, which were controlled by the UAE, to launch an offensive to seize Hodeidah, which is a port city in Yemen. We'll look at these maps in just a moment. That's some of the footage that was released of Yemen's Ansar Allah launching missiles and drones at the targets of the Saudi-backed proxy forces. Of course, if you are somebody that follows the corporate media, you'll hear them refer to Ansar Allah and the Yemeni armed forces as the Houthis or the Iranian proxies, Iran-backed or Iran-controlled militants or whatever. As we've gone through a number of times on this stream, this is just ridiculous propaganda. And even in the Arabic language media, the vast majority of the media outlets will still call them the Houthis, insist upon calling them Houthis, because quite frankly, these Arabic language channels are controlled by the Gulf states, and they have no interest in legitimizing Ansar Allah or acknowledging that they control the majority of Yemen's population, that they live under them, and that they, of course, have, from the very start, they've had 2/3 of the Yemeni armed forces on their side, that they operate a government out of the capital city, and the opposition are a bunch of proxies for Saudi Arabia and before the United Arab Emirates. With that being said, to take a look at some of these maps here. So some of the strikes that were committed were carried out against targets in Marib and Jouf. Others were carried out against targets in Hadramaut in Yemen. Here's on the map, you see in the green there, that represents territory that's controlled by Ansar Allah. This is, of course, a zoomed in map just showing the specific areas here that were targeted. And then there have been clashes also that have been taking place further south in Yemen, in Taiz, and also strikes, ballistic missile and drone strikes against Al-Mukha, which is that port city in the yellow zone that you can see represented on the map. But those clashes on the ground have been taking place. Ansar Allah at the moment appears to be carrying out primarily what is a campaign to target the bases and weapons depots. It's also killed commanders in the Saudi-backed forces in Yemen. So it's committed assassination attacks against high-profile individuals, which have been rather successful. And Saudi Arabia is sort of shaking in its boots here, because here's some footage allegedly of the Ansar Allah attack, or at least that they claimed, on the Jubail oil facility. At least that is, this footage here was not confirmed, but that is allegedly from a distance. Somebody took this footage. There are photos that are confirmed which show this as well, that were released. And Ansar Allah are not pulling any punches. The Yemeni armed forces are launching drone and missile attacks on Saudi oil facilities simply for Saudi Arabia violating Yemen's airspace. Now, what we're seeing is that Saudi Arabia has been carrying out airstrikes against Yemeni positions. I believe there were reports that came in just about an hour ago, but them launching airstrikes against positions of the Yemeni armed forces. And so we can expect to see things escalate even more in the near future. Also, Iran claims to have shot down a number of drones that were fired, allegedly Lucas drones. This is some of the footage that was published claiming to show down drones. And so those drones are operated by the United States. There are claims that they were fired from the territory of the United Arab Emirates. And notably, there have been a lot of tankers targeted by Iran off the coast of the United Arab Emirates and belonging to the United Arab Emirates as well. But what we're seeing now is that Yemen's Ansar Allah are themselves taking out ships and then launching ballistic missiles. Cancel that here. Launching ballistic missile attacks against here, Mukha, this port city here, which is under the de facto control of the Saudi proxy forces, hitting them with drones and missiles. And there has been, of course, a mass mobilization of forces by Yemen's Ansar Allah to fight these battles, to try and retake their territory. They're also imposing a blockade on Saudi Arabia, locking down the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down here. And that has imposed a massive cost on them. So it's been a real struggle for these forces. And a lot of them are actually fleeing their positions because of the Yemeni missile and drone onslaught, which again has been persistent. It's clear that Yemen's Ansar Allah have a large target bank, that they are going after these forces. And just so everyone is aware, this is not, a lot of people try and sell the Yemen conflict as being separate from, in some cases, the Iran war, which pretty clearly it's very much part of the regional war, but also from Israel and what's going on in Gaza. And of course, initially, Israel not only supported the actions of the Saudi-led coalition when they attacked Yemen in 2015, but Israeli forces themselves were sent over to Emirati territory to train UAE-backed forces. I believe some of that training actually happened in Oman at one point. And they trained these forces in order to attack Ansarullah. So the Israelis provided direct training to UAE-backed militants in Yemen to fight against Ansarullah. And we know as well from the leaked documents and even admissions of British and American officials that the Americans and the British militaries provided logistical support and, of course, weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, coordinated everything with them to attack Yemen in a conflict which killed over 400,000 people in Yemen and imposed this medieval blockade on the territory. Now, if Yemen manages to liberate itself and become an independent country, it will be the only Arab country that currently that resists Israel, that is independent, and that will actually be standing in the way of Israeli conspiracies and the Greater Israel project in the region. It will be the only one. That's why Yemen is so incredibly important. Because if Yemen liberates its territory, forces these Saudi-backed forces out, or does an agreement, most likely what's going to happen is there'll be agreements struck with them. And others like the Islah Party and these groups, they'll break up into their individual factions and they can do agreements with some. Others will flee the country, and then their people will be left to deal with the negotiating process afterwards if this pans out this way. But inside of Yemen, if the situation develops, the country is united, they get access to their resources, they will be a major player. And they've even spoke recently, Ansarullah, that is, their officials have spoke about imposing fees on transiting Bab el-Mandeb and accessing the Red Sea. Now, this is important, of course, because it's not just oil and gas that goes through the Red Sea area. It is all of the goods and imports to Europe that are traveling here, everything that goes through the Suez Canal. So if Yemen locks down Bab el-Mandeb and hasn't imposed a full blockade on it yet, just a blockade on Saudi Arabia, but if it imposes a full blockade, then this is going to have major repercussions for Egypt's economy, the Suez Canal. So this is a major development. And again, if Yemen isn't in fact capable of liberating its territory, we're going to see that the entire region will be dramatically shaped, because now you have Iran and Yemen together, both independent governments, don't depend on the West or anyone else for that matter, and shape their own policies. And they both are supportive of the Palestinian resistance. And in Yemen's case, is quite happy directly intervening on behalf of Gaza against the Israelis and firing ballistic missiles and drones with its limited capabilities in comparison to Iran. So right now we're seeing that all of these oil and gas facilities are being targeted in Saudi Arabia. Saudi is paying the price for its war in Yemen. And lo and behold, guess who's back on the scene? Oh, the so-called Sovereign Giants brigades, right? And the reason I'm pulling up this here, this is from earlier this year, but it's important to note, the Southern Giants Brigades, which were formerly a UAE-backed militia group inside of Yemen, which were the most powerful force affiliated with what was known as the Southern Transitional Council, just UAE proxies, ended up actually transitioning and owing its allegiance to the Saudi-backed regime. Now, who are the Southern Giants Brigades? For anyone who's interested, the toughest fighters and its commanders are all ex-Al-Qaeda and in some cases ex-Daesh or ISIS fighters. That's who's fighting Yemen's Ansar Allah. But in the West, Ansar Allah are deemed the terrorists and the crazy thugs and militias and all of this. And the internationally recognized government, some of the fiercest fighters on their side, are composed of Al-Qaeda and Daesh-minded people who have what they call a Salafi outlook, an extremist outlook, which aligns with the belief system of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS. So the United States backing the Saudis, Israel backing the Saudis, and the Saudis, who are they using? They're using people who have the mentality of Al-Qaeda. And in some cases, Al-Qaeda and Daesh fought directly on the side of these forces during the war. But they don't want to tell you that. They won't inform you about what's actually going on the ground in Yemen. You have to believe blindly about Yemen that Ansar Allah are the terrorists. They're the designated terrorist organization. And they, in your mind, when you think of Islamic terrorists and fundamentalists, you think of ISIS. But these guys are actually fighting ISIS. And this is something actually I explained before, and I think it's worth stating again. The UAE, its strongest forces inside of Yemen, Al-Qaeda and Daesh-minded individuals who were formerly members. And then the UAE was also backing, continues here, Israel is created these 5 militant groups in the Gaza Strip, which are spotted throughout the territory that Israel controls in Gaza, illegally, of course, in violation of the so-called ceasefire agreement. So these 5 groups are, again, in their ranks, filling their ranks, are former Al-Qaeda and Daesh militants. And these are people that Hamas, which again, we're told Hamas are the terrorists, Ansar Allah are the terrorists, they're like ISIS, they're like Al-Qaeda, they're the same thing. We're told that by the Israelis, we're told that by the US Trump administration, we're told that by the EU, right? That they're the equivalents in this part of the world of ISIS and Al-Qaeda are Hamas and Hezbollah in their respective locations. And yet, Ansar Allah fights against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and fights against militant factions, which include these people with that mindset and formerly members of those groups in their ranks. And in Gaza, Hamas not only cracked down historically and fought battles against Al-Qaeda and their splinter groups, all their groups which popped up throughout the Gaza Strip, cracked down on these hardline Salafist fighters, but they also destroyed ISIS when it popped up in Gaza too. And there were cases of these Salafi groups that would emerge in the Gaza Strip of them launching rockets at times when Hamas and the other factions did not want to engage in a fight. There were perhaps negotiations going on, even with Fatah in the West Bank, and they would want to screw this up by launching rockets. And they would do stuff like that on their behalf. And now, for a long time, people speculated these groups must be controlled by Israel. Today, these militant groups that Israel has created are not direct Al-Qaeda and Daesh, but they are militants. A lot of them are formally affiliated with these groups and have that mentality. And they fund them, and they give them weapons, and they train them, and they send them into fight. And they hide this from everyone. They don't want you to know it. Talking about Al-Qaeda, because, always comes back to this. In Syria, a lot's been happening. The government now in Damascus, which Donald Trump very proudly says that he put Al-Qaeda's guy in power in Damascus, and now the Al-Qaeda government, or the government led by the former leader of Syria's wing of Al-Qaeda, is best friends with the United States. But there's been some developments that have occurred on that front, because there are a number of different measures that were taken in order to try and unify Syrian territory under the leadership of Ahmed al-Shara, or Abu Muhammad al-Julani. One of them was that they committed to an offensive against the Kurdish forces of what was known as the Syrian Democratic Party forces. And the SDF officially disbanded, or it merged its fighters in with the Syrian Arab Army, as it's called. The Syrian Arab Republic still claims this title. For those people that think that they're fighting for an Islamic cause, apparently this is supposed to be a secular government. So for those people, that's what they're fighting for, right? And this has caused a lot of division as well inside of Syria, where some groups are like, no, we'd rather go with ISIS. We're going to carry out suicide bombings against government checkpoints because they're not an Islamic government. They're a secular government led by a guy that's former head of Al-Qaeda. And in their ranks, they have many people who are former Al-Qaeda, some of them former ISIS as well, of course. Even Ahmed al-Shara, he used to be a commander in ISIS. But without getting into that, there was supposed to be a return of Kurdish families, about 400 of them, to an area that's located along the Syrian border with Turkey, which is called Ras Al Ain. And so here's this is Kurdish media outlet here. They run with the story. Syria responsible for securing the return of displaced families, the United Nations. So what happened here is that when the Turkish military in 2019 invaded the area, they put it under the control of their proxy group, which was called the Syrian, what was it called? This armed Syrian National Army. That's what it was. There are so many names for these groups, which were like a collection of militants that used to be in the Al-Qaeda linked groups. Some of them were more secular, and they paid a bunch of these people to form the Syrian National Army, which occupied a strip of territory in northern Syria. And as a result, of course, there were Kurds who were displaced. And recently what's happened is there was supposed to be a return of around 400 of these Kurdish families to the area, and there were attacks on them when they tried to return by militants. Now, if you believe the not the what you call maybe the SDF, I don't know if it officially there is an SDF to be spoken of anymore, but they used to be the Syrian Democratic Forces, which under U.S. support governed effectively northeast Syria and allowed the U.S. to occupy Syria's oil and gas fields and the most fertile agricultural land. So they struck a deal with the U.S. to do this. But as has happened every single time with these Kurdish groups, they align themselves with the United States, and then the United States betrays them and lets them get screwed. So in this case, the United States were willing to back the Kurdish forces. This is what happened under Bashar al-Assad, because the United States, part of the blockade, the siege that they were imposing on Syria, which collectively punished the entire population and destroyed the Syrian economy, alongside their sanctions, was to withhold their agricultural lands and withhold their oil and gas facilities, which were based in northeastern Syria. And so they backed the Kurdish groups, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were primarily led by Kurds. And as soon as Turkey came in twice, in 2018 and then again in 2019, the first operation, I think it was called Operation Olive Branch, and the second one was Operation Peace Springs or something like that. But they seized territory from the SDF. Turkey, they accused the SDF of being affiliated with the YPG and the PKK and these other groups, which in the Turkish consider them terrorist organizations officially. They don't want them on their border. There's a whole dispute. I won't get into it with the Kurdish issue and repression of Kurdish movements inside of Turkey itself. But they took territory in the north, and the United States just ran away both times. They deserted, left them for dead, and then, backing them all of this time to keep Syria's oil and gas resources out of the hands of a centralized Syrian government in Damascus and to put pressure on it and destroy it, all because, this is the reason why, all because Bashar al-Assad refused to kick Iran out of Syria and refused to crack down on weapons going to Hezbollah. He facilitated those weapons going to Hezbollah in Lebanon and was openly in support of the Palestinians. That's the only reason. They didn't give a damn about anything else. You can give every reason in the world you want why you hate Bashar al-Assad and all of that. That's not why the United States was withholding the oil and gas resources. If Bashar al-Assad would have kicked the Iranians out, closed off the border to Hezbollah, which he would have been able to do a lot more effectively than the current regime in power now, by the way, if he would have agreed to do that. Kick out all of those Iraqi militias and other forces from the Golan, give up the claim to the Golan Heights completely, and maybe give some support here like other Arab countries for Palestinian human rights here and there, but ultimately bow down to Israel. If he would have done that, Bashar al-Assad would have continued to be the president of Syria. I guarantee you, I say it with absolute certainty, he would still be the president of Syria today if he would have done that. And the United States would have lifted all of the economic sanctions along with the Europeans, and Bashar al-Assad would have been in all the Arab capitals and would have been in Washington, D.C. and all of that. They do not give a damn about any of those reasons that were given. None, not whatsoever. How's this relevant to the Kurdish question right now? So the issue of the Kurdish forces, right? We'll pull up on a map the area, so you can just, it's better always to see these things visually, I think. So as you can see, Ras Al Ain, which the Kurds have a different name for, like Northeast Syria to them is called Rojava. They have a different name for Ras Al Ain as well. It's right next to the border here of Turkey. And of course, it fell under their control after they invaded Syrian territory in an operation that they said was protecting them from Kurdish militant groups. There's a long history here of all of this stuff, which is interesting because these Kurdish forces, which they call this territory here in northeast Syria, Rojava, they aligned themselves with the Americans. They aligned themselves with the Israelis. The Israelis were able to set up drone bases inside northeastern Syria. They had great relations, and inroads into the SDF. But the SDF would probably never be a thing if it actually wasn't for the Palestinian resistance. And a lot of people forget this, but those Kurdish groups, like the PKK, zoomed into Aleppo for some reason, like the PKK, really are only a thing because they were trained by the PLO in Lebanon. And they actually got their starts there because the Palestine Liberation Organization backed them and gave them support. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, gave the Kurdish movement support. And there's long-standing ties between the PFLP. That still exists today, the PFLP communist movements. But, this is how history goes. They're no longer so much on the side of the Palestinians here. Just pull this down. Seems like we're having some technical issues here. So yeah, with that being said, that's not exactly the case today, but the Kurdish groups get used and abused, like we see in Iraq. It's the exact same thing. The United States wants them to perform a role. They'll send them weapons, they'll send them funding, they help them with all of this stuff, and then as soon as they don't need them anymore, they discarded them. They just let them get defeated and killed. And the same thing happened late last year and in January when Jolani or Ahmed al-Shara, when his forces of the new Syrian armed forces advanced to capture northeastern Syria, the United States wanted there to be a unification. They didn't care about the Kurdish project whatsoever, because again, they don't care about anything in the region but Israel and dominating everyone. That's all they give a damn about. But all these different groups, unfortunately, in the region, time and time and time again, align themselves with the Israelis and align themselves with the United States. And then when they get burnt, they turn around and go, why did this happen to me? Why am I saying this? Because there's lots of people, of course, they still have these delusions about Ahmed al-Shara. And the same way you see these people, a lot of them, most of them in the Persian diaspora, who are Iranians, who are advocating for bombing their grandmother's house and are pro-Israeli, and everyone that's not pro-Israel is a regime supporter. In the end, they get left for dead. They're useful idiots for their cause. That's how they get treated. That's how they are thought of. When the Israelis and the US, in their think tanks, their intelligence agencies, their lobby organized, all of these people making things work and pushing for policy. Why do you think they're doing this? What do you think they talk about? When they talk to each other in private, how do you think they talk about the Syrians now, the Syrian government? Like they're dogs, like they're dirt, like they're their slaves, because they are their slaves. They agree to be their slaves. And here's the thing, because a lot has happened since the war in February 28, when it started, when the United States launched this war. And there's a lot of tensions that have been happening, and there's all these statements being made back and forth. So you should probably hear it from them themselves and how they speak. So this is a clip here of SF Orion, who's a former brigadier general in the Israeli military and worked for Israeli intelligence. And here he is at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is one of the sort of leading Zionist think tanks in Washington, was instrumental in making the arguments and pushing for the Bush administration to enter into the Iraq war. Very hawkish, right? It's been described as a wing of the Israel lobby in Washington, the think tank wing, along with the likes of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And here you go, out of the horse's mouth. This was last year during the ceasefire in Lebanon, because people now, again, will claim that, well, Hezbollah are the reason for what's happening inside of Lebanon. And, Jolani's forces, one day they're going to liberate Palestine and all of the stuff that we hear them talk about. Here, just take a listen to this.
Which kind of ceasefire it is? Well, Hezbollah mostly.
This is during that 15-month period when Israel violated the ceasefire 15,400 times, more times than had ever been violated in recorded history that a ceasefire had ever been violated, just for reference here.
Ceased its attacks, and Israel is mostly continuing its fire on whatever violation Hezbollah is implementing or committing, even though there's an official ceasefire. I think the Lebanese leadership right now is quite comfortable with that arrangement. I would say lamenting publicly, but probably are benefiting from this direct enforcement as an ultimate backstop to whatever they are. doing. And we need to also understand that these ongoing attacks indicate that Hezbollah is trying to rebuild. We are hearing day in, day out about weapon transfers foiled or thwarted by the Syrians over the border, and occasional attacks by Israel over the border. And so it's an ongoing effort to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't resurge.
So there you go. That was during the ceasefire period. And by the way, when people like myself would talk about the so-called Lebanese government, I call them so-called because they don't represent Lebanon. They represent Washington and Israel inside of Lebanon. When I was arguing that they didn't care about the South, they had abandoned the South, and that ultimately there's a conspiracy for them to work against Hezbollah in the country, and that the same thing back in that time, Syria had not yet officially signed on to its mechanism that it established with the Israelis for coordination, which involved economic developments as well, right? So in essence, Syria recognized Israel. That happened before Lebanon recognized Israel, the governments of these countries. Of course, the people are not in line with that. Even the ones, by the way, that support the Syrian government currently, if you ask them whether they're fans of Israel, the answer is going to be no, but they'll do mental gymnastics to try and explain to you why somehow, we need to focus on the economy, and the economy is the most important thing and all of that. Well, you have your oil and gas resources back. You don't have sanctions anymore. Why is all the sectarian killing going on? Why these instances, like with the Kurds returning to a border area and suddenly people are opening fire on them, or all of these suicide bombings in neighborhoods of minorities, and the attacks in the coast that occurred, and these extrajudicial executions that are constantly happening, this has not been dealt with. This is constant, and the economic recovery is not there. Where's the economic recovery that everyone was talking about? Where's the massive flood of the Syrian refugees from Lebanon and Turkey and the West all coming back to Syria? Where's that? And if you're all about economics, then why was there a revolution then? Why do you even have a revolution? If it's all about Syria needs to be prosperous and economically viable, well, if it was all about the economy, well, Syria had some of the best universities in the region. The people in all the neighboring countries in Jordan, if you speak to anyone from Jordan or Lebanon, on their weekends, they would go to Damascus to go and buy food and groceries, and it was cheap. It was a great place to go on holiday. It was a great place to go just for a day or so. Economically, it was independent. It didn't have foreign debt. So if your whole argument is we need to make Syria economically strong at the expense of having an open relations with the Israelis and the US, the whole point here is that if you had a revolution, what was your revolution even about to begin with? What was the whole purpose in it? And again, you cannot get a straight answer from people who have this blind cult belief where they think Abu Muhammad al-Julani is Allah, is God. And the same people, the same mentality, the same exact mentality of Iranians who worship the Shah's son. It's the exact same mentality. They cannot tolerate any criticism. And unfortunately, these people get used in the region to go and be pawns to destroy their own countries. And it was the same in the case, by the way, there are people that were used from the Iraqi diaspora when the United States wanted to go into Iraq and justify invading Iraq and blowing up the country, dismantling the government, toppling Saddam Hussein. And always they just prey on that you don't know anything about these conflicts. And if you make any of these arguments about the Israelis and the US having a conspiracy, then oh, well, you're a supporter of the regime and you support this and you support that. I don't support chaotic breakdowns of entire nations, which force hundreds of thousands, millions of people from their homes, which kill hundreds of thousands of people. And we see this, the situation in Syria constantly escalating. And even the Americans wanted to control this. But I'll tell you what actually happened in Syria when the government of Syria fell. There was a conspiracy for Idlib, which was under the control of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who became Ahmed al-Shara later when he changed his name. He can't be calling himself Jolani because literally he's disarming anyone that's around Dara or Quneitra who want to fight the Israelis, and is just completely betraying the Golan Heights, right? And sits there as Trump talks about the Golan Heights, how he gave it to Israel. Jolani sat there and smiled like a good boy. You can't call yourself Jolani anymore, right? You have to call because Jolani, right, from the Golan Heights. So you have to call yourself Ahmed Shara now and put on a suit and you're all professional, right? So the plan was to capture Aleppo and to set up a resistance in Aleppo. And they were trying to even mimic at the time the Palestinian resistance, because what had happened is they had like this spokesperson for the resistance, the Aleppo resistance. I forget the name that they gave this guy, but he wore kufiya over his face and he spoke literally like the dollar store version of Abu Ubaidah, who was the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades of Hamas. You can go search it up. I'm sure it's there. The videos are there. I have to pull them up actually on one of the streams to show you the comparison between the two, because it was so comical, like how badly they wanted to imitate the Palestinian resistance, because they know the Palestinian resistance is actually organic and legitimate. So they wanted to imitate that. And they set this whole thing up. But what happened is everyone got bought out in Syria and the whole thing collapsed because there was nothing left to fight for in Syria anymore. And then they just waltzed into Damascus. They didn't fight. There was no fighting that took place. But the idea was to have a civil war conflict reignited with Aleppo as the headquarters, and everyone could pour in from Turkey, and it could be chaotic. And in the meantime, maybe the United States could try and, develop a character to take over Syria eventually. But, and that would have drained Iran financially, would have also, if the Russians would commit themselves to it, would have drained the Russians financially. The Ukrainian armed forces were involved in operating drones in that operation to capture Aleppo, right? They trained these teams on drones and how to use the drones for this offensive. And they're affiliated with them because, of course, again, Jolani and Ahmed Shara, it's just one big MI6 CIA project, right? In Syria. That's what it always was. That's what it's always about. They didn't care about the Syrian people. They didn't care about any of the suffering, all of this stuff about torturing and mass graves and executions. They did not give a damn about anything. In fact, the more death, the better, because the more hatred it stirs and the more people want to kill each other. And that's what they want. They want you to kill each other so that they can take advantage of you. That's the entire reason. And so they wanted Syria in this a revived civil war. What happened is the entire government collapsed like a deck of cards, and suddenly then Jolani is the natural option to take over Damascus because he's the prominent leader of Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, the most powerful faction in Idlib. So then they're left with this guy. And so now here he is, the savior, who's walked into Masjid al-Umawi, right, the big mosque in Damascus, and given his speeches and all the rest of it. And all of his fighters, fanatics, and they're willing to, stand on his side. Some are too fanatic for him and his new government that was formed. But these people, they're not controlled in the way they were under Bashar al-Assad. So the situation in Syria, they want everything merged in. They would like to have those Syrian Democratic Forces guys on the same side as Sholani. And the only reason why in the south, the Druze, these separatist groups that have been created amongst the Druze, Israel has taken advantage of that because historically, even under Bashar al-Assad, the Druze technically sided with Bashar, but they were very, very hesitant to get involved. And it took a number of massacres against them by groups that were either backed by Israel at the time or affiliated with Israel-backed Al-Qaeda proxies. There were a dozen groups that Israel backed in the south of the country. It was these massacres committed against the Druze population, which convinced them to actually start fighting on the side of the Syrian government. But the Druze have always been rather separate. They've had their clans, and they didn't want to be, they weren't the Syrian Arab army like it operated in other areas. There was a special arrangement with these groups. The Israelis took advantage of that because they want access to that sovereign strip of land inside of Syrian territory, what they call David's corridor, so that they can pass across the Euphrates and have access into Iraq. What we learned during the 40-day war was that in northern Iraq, there were Israeli bases that were set up. And they had them as well. The SDF allowed the Israelis to have drone bases that were operating in northeastern Syria. But the Israelis took advantage of the situation, the special situation with the Druze inside of the country. And they're not fully controlled 100% by anyone. So they took advantage. They started funding these separatist militias. And then eventually the United States brokered a deal where they would be sort of semi-autonomous in a way, not officially having their own autonomy, right, and a Druze state, but in a way they're sort of semi-autonomous. They get to control their own area. And the same has occurred with the Kurds, and on unofficial levels, all throughout the country, different militant groups have their control in their respective areas of Syria. So the United States wants Syria at this time to be one at this current moment. The reason why it wants that is because it wants to have all those groups under its unified command. So if anything goes down and they have to get any fight going or whatever, they don't have all these external conflicts going on all over the place. But these militant factions are so extreme that they just can't help themselves but shoot a few Kurds or blow up a bus full of Druze or go into the countryside and start shooting the Alawi. Everyone is the evil Rafida and the evil Shabiha and all of these things, right? For the Shia and then the supporters of the regime, right? Which is funny because they're now the regime, right? But and the mental gymnastics of these people is insane in Syria, because there are videos that just emerged from Deir ez-Zor where they sort of took over the border crossing area between Iraq and Syria. And apparently they are preparing some sort of operation around Deir ez-Zor. And they're marching and they're chanting things like Khaybar, Khaybar, ya Yahud, which is literally like referencing Jews, and like as if they're going to fight, basically that they're going to fight against the Israelis. That's what they're letting on, right? But of course, you know, it's got to be, it's targeted specifically that historic battle against the Jews and calling them themselves Jaysh al-Muhammad, which is the army of Muhammad. But you're the Syrian Arab army of the Syrian Arab Republic. You're not the Islamic army. You're not Jaysh al-Islam anymore. You're not Hayat Tahrir al-Sham anymore. You know? But these people who are supposed to be the military of Syria, who are, again, militia guys who can't even march in formation properly most of the time, this is the sort of stuff they're chanting. But they have now a joint fusion mechanism with the Israelis. They're openly aligned with the United States. They have U.S. forces, U.S. boots on the ground. They train with the United States. They receive backing by the United States, and they're fighting against the Palestinians. Not directly, But they're stopping weapons transfers from going into Lebanon. Not all of them are for Hezbollah. Some of them are for Palestinian factions that they're trying to target. And the whole point of this is to ensure that there can be no resistance against Israel. And these guys are walking around with their rifles and chanting stuff against, we're going to fight the Jews. The level of mental gymnastics that it takes to be in this position and to do this is truly astounding. But this is the sort of thing that you see. It's no different to the people that support Donald Trump, who said he's going to drain the swamp and he's going to arrest all of the sexual predators and he's going to go after them all and he's going to end all the foreign wars and he's going to do all of that. And then the guy starts more foreign wars, kills more civilians. You know, he didn't drain the swamp. He jumped in and started swimming and invited in all of his AIPAC buddies and, you know, and his buddies from the, what do you call it? The Freedom Center. Forgetting his name, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and, you know, created an even more ugly swamp that he is now operating as the official swamp monster and gets exposed by the Epstein files, and his supporters are still there talking about how great he is. It's the same ideology. It's the same exact like hero worship, like idol worship, where they have this idol and he can do no bad. Only good. He can only do good. Everything he does is holy. He's basically Jesus, right? And you see that mentality, which you'll see it in the case of the United States with a leader like Trump. You see it in the case of Syria with a leader like Ahmed al-Shara. You see it in the case of Iran with a non-leader. He's not actually a leader, but the Shah's son. It's the same concept. There is no rational explanation behind any of this stuff. And then that Western corporate media and the Western governments and all turn around and tell you, you need to fear the Muslims. And there's these terrorist groups in the Middle East and Hamas is so terrible. And you need to worry about Iran and its nuclear weapons and the 52 billion, trillion, quadrillion people that were killed in 0.5 of a second in Iran by the evil mullah regime and all of this nonsense stuff that they push towards you. And it's all the same stuff. The stuff they're saying about Iran now and the alleged 52,000, according to Trump, it might change. Tomorrow it's going to be 152,000, right? Not even making this up. Probably I could wake up tomorrow morning and 152,000 now is a new number of Iranian innocent, peaceful protesters that were killed for no reason, even though Trump admits to sending weapons to some of them. Oh, but hey, let's just ignore that, right? The beheaded babies in Gaza and the babies out of incubators in Kuwait, right? And the weapons of mass destruction, all of it. The same stuff, the same nonsense that we're hearing there, and we're supposed to be fighting all of these wars in the Middle East against these people, killing these people, creating intergenerational trauma and beef between families who go out and fight each other generation on now inside of Syria, killing each other for things that they can't even remember in some cases, and just targeting people because of the way that they identify inside of the country, which was never the case before and never happened in this way. We create all these problems because we're told we need to fear the Muslims and Al-Qaeda. But if you look anywhere in the region, who's fighting, who's on the side of Al-Qaeda? So the West created Al-Qaeda. It backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan because it wanted to fight the Soviets. And that ended up leading to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So they're on the side of Al-Qaeda in Syria throughout the war. They admitted as such. Then they put Al-Qaeda's leader, former leader, in control of Syria. In Gaza, Israel creates 5 militant groups filled with these ex-Al-Qaeda, ex-Daesh people. All of these ISIS leaders just so happen to be in Camp Bucca and in U.S. facilities, and just so happen to all have weird affiliations with all of these Western intelligence agencies. Who could have guessed? It just happened to be Western intelligence agents that were facilitating loads of these fighters pouring into Syria across the border to fight. Oh, it's just it's a coincidence. Israel is backing 12 of these groups. It's a coincidence, total coincidence. And then in Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, which has all this propaganda which it pushes about radical Islam and how we need to be, the Middle East, the only country that works is the UAE, right? Because we oppose the radical. And then the ideology that they push in the Muslim world is what? The vision of these Salafist types, of these people that identify as Salafi, right? Which are the people that you will see populating groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, who follow the teachings of Hamid Abdul Wahab. And this stuff, like in every single region, you'll see more and more emerges about them backing all of these. But then those images are put on our TV screens. We're told, fear the Muslims and the Muslim invasion. And now the Israeli propaganda, these Israeli propagandists are at their final stages where they're trying to capture your imagination again. So they want to push fear porn on you to try and make you scared of the Muslim invaders and all of this stuff. Everything that they promote about why you need to fear Muslims, either they created it directly, they fund it, they're affiliated with it. All these wars are because of them. All of them. There's not a single war in the region where, and it has resulted in this blowback that we see, that everyone's scared of. There's not a single one that they didn't support, that they weren't involved in. All of it, they're involved in. And they don't even tell you about some of them. But who knew anything about, I guarantee you, the vast majority of people, even on our channel, we have people that tend to be a bit more educated about these things, who seek out Mint Press News and want to learn more about these things. So we tend to have people that know a little bit more about Yemen and Palestine and all of these issues than, and like to investigate things on their own. But for the general population, the majority of the people who just maybe see some stuff come through their on social media here and there, they don't fully understand it, or they follow corporate media reporting. They don't know anything about Yemen. Yemen just was never covered. They don't know anything about Ansar Allah. They probably didn't even know that that was its name. All they know is Iran-backed Houthis and all of this stuff and nothing else. And in fact, I'll be honest, even in the Arab world, there's a lot of people in the Arab world that they don't know anything about Yemen either. And it's done purposefully because they don't want you to know anything about these countries. Like, we have been taught and told about the dangers of Islam since right after 9/11. But of course, before that, there were, the Orientalist nonsense about Muslims in the Arab world. But all of this stuff that started coming out after 9/11, this focus on Islamic extremism and fighting and this war on terror and all of this stuff, why can't people just name basic facts about Islam? Why do most people not know that Iranians are not Arabs? That Afghans are not Arabs? Like, if you speak to average people in the West, they won't know this. But we're bombing every single one of those countries we've attacked. We've attacked Iraq. We've attacked all the Arab countries, right? And even the modern borders were drawn up by Western countries, right? But attacked Iraq, attacked Iran, attacked Afghanistan, all next to each other. I guarantee you, if you were to go on the street and ask people anything about these, they would not know that they speak different languages. Of course, Afghanistan and Iran have variations of Farsi that they speak, but they're different ethnicities, right? They're different groups of people. They're not the same. Like, Afghans are not Arab, they're not Iranian, right? Or they're not Persian, let's say, because there are Arabs who actually live inside of Iran. But nobody knows any of this stuff. They won't teach you about that. They won't teach you about where, like, the boogeyman version of Islam, which they present to the West, where that came from and who endorsed it, Who's behind putting the Saudi family in its position? Who collaborated with them? And then what did that ideology allow to take hold in the Middle East that came from Najd in Saudi Arabia? And all these movements that get backed, like, who's behind backing all of this all the way and putting that money in their hands? Every single thing. It's the British and the Americans, and of course the Israelis are involved in the groups, right? But they don't want you to know any of that stuff. They don't want you to know that Al-Qaeda was on the so-called West's side in Syria, and still is, right? Because those Al-Qaeda groups, where did they go? They just disappeared, did they? Now, some of them are a bit more radical, and they wanted to be part of ISIS cells, which are not really, like, they don't have a centralized leadership like they used to have in the same way. There's sort of cells that pop up. And in some of the cases, the people that you hear that are called ISIS, some of them are just independent groups. Like in the Sinai, they created an ISIS splinter group. In Gaza, they created an ISIS splinter group, but Hamas, the Qassam brigades of Hamas, eliminated them, like killed a bunch of them and imprisoned them, right? Got rid of them very quickly. But these groups that you see popping up, they feel like the Syrian government currently is not radical enough for them because they wanted an Islamic government. But the Al-Qaeda guys, quite frankly, are just not smart, and they don't even know that they're getting screwed over of what their belief system even is. But that belief system, where did it come from? Who funded it? Who's behind it? All of these takfiri groups, where did it come from? Who was behind it? Every single time. And they want to make us believe that this is all about religion and a religious war and all of this stuff. It's just like peak nonsense, and it depends entirely on ignorance. If you're not ignorant about the region, then you would know that everything that they're presenting to you is false. But again, they don't want you to know anything about Yemen. Hundreds of thousands of children starving to death in Iraq. That was nothing for them as a price. The awful sanctions on Syria, which deteriorated the country, that meant nothing. The constant invasions of Lebanese territory and tens of thousands killed, they don't care about that. They don't care about anything. Look at Egypt, as if you normalize with Israel and you come into the circle of peace, your conditions get so much better. Well, Egypt has declined rapidly. Egypt, before and after normalization, I mean, the closer Egypt got with the Israelis in terms of economic deals, it gets screwed over on gas now. It's now importing, not exporting to the Israelis. And it got screwed over, and its people's wealth got siphoned off. They just sold out the resources of the Egyptian people for peanuts while the people continue to suffer, and the situation deteriorates further and further. The infrastructure deteriorates. People get poorer and poorer inside of Egypt. Never worked for them. How's Lebanon doing now that it recognized Israel, with the south of the country occupied and the bombing constantly going on? How's that going for it? How's Syria going right now? Because I can guarantee you, if any Palestinian group liberated Palestine and took the land back, by the way, you would have a swarm of Palestinian refugees from all over the globe, from every single corner of the world, coming and flocking to go back and live in Palestine. Do we see that in Syria? Some people might go on holiday in Syria, and spend some time in some cafes in Damascus here and there, and sort of just ignore all the negative things that will pop up, and then go back to wherever they were living, because that's it. And only a select group of them can do that, because some of them, they're fearing consequences of going back. And if you're a minority community in Syria, you probably don't want to go back in a lot of cases. So it's just like absolute chaos. And by the way, looks like the final showdown is coming. This is footage from taken satellite imagery of an airbase in Israel, and it shows, at least according to reports, 26 different refueling aircraft, U.S. refueling aircraft there. And it looks like the United States will either have to make the decision to fully pull out of the entire region, not very likely, and force the Israelis to withdraw from southern Lebanon and Gaza, or it's about to all go down. And we'll, of course, continue to monitor all of this and bring you all of the latest footage, the breakdowns as well. The maps may start changing inside of Yemen pretty soon, so we'll continue to bring you all the updates there. It's a very important front to focus on. There's a lot of things that we didn't cover here today, which we'll perhaps get into in our stream on Thursday. And if you have got this far, please do hit that like button. If you add a comment below, let us know your thoughts. And of course, it helps in the algorithm as well. So that does help us out. And if you did like what you've seen in this episode, if you are returning and you like watching these streams, you want them to continue, then please do consider joining either our Patreon or our YouTube membership here, because you keep this show alive. It's 100% viewer funded. So we will strive to do our best, make sure that we bring you the best coverage possible of what's going on, and delve into these topics as deep as we can go to explore everything. And so until Thursday, when we'll have more updates, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, night, wherever you're watching in the world. We will be back same place, same time on Thursday with more developments. Something that we didn't cover today and get into, perhaps we'll look at it more next time, is the Syrian resistance. Actually, before we go, let's pull up this, because there's a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance in Syria, Islamic Resistance Front in Syria. They announced that they carried out strikes in Daraa in southern Syria. And they actually published a video of them carrying out these attacks. So this is a smaller group. It's actually got a official spokesperson now, and they've appointed a leadership. And here they're firing a rocket barrage, these unguided rockets, towards an Israeli military outpost in Daraa. And this is the first footage that we've seen of them actually carrying out an operation like this. There are smaller little groups that have independently declared war against the Israelis at different points. We should expect to see some more of these operations, but large-scale attacks, I think, perhaps will take some time for any groups like this to commit themselves to. They've got, on one hand, the Syrian government, which wants them disarmed. And on the other hand, of course, if the Israelis do a massive incursion into Syria, it could hurt their ability to build up their arsenals and tunnel systems and all the rest of it. So that's something that we're going to continue to monitor. Does seem to be spooking out the Israelis, and anything is really possible in Syria, because there's a lot of people who are not happy with the situation. There are those that appear to be aligned more with Iran and Hezbollah, but there are independent groups that are completely separate to them who also have announced that they want to resist Israel, have opened fire on the Israelis, even just individuals that have carried out operations against the Israelis. And so there is potential for a resistance forming. And I think that will naturally be the conclusion in Syria, that you have like this government that is just completely, it just grows more and more relevant, and there will be a resistance that forms against the Israelis in the south. Sort of what happened in Lebanon might end up occurring in Syria. But that really does depend, because if Syria actually wants to do what the US is trying to force it to do and invade Lebanon, well, the current administration in Syria might not be there for very long. So, of course, again, we'll continue to follow all of this, and we'll go perhaps a little bit deeper into that and those groups that have popped up in Syria next time, depending upon what's happening in Lebanon, there's been, of course, another escalation. There's a bombing campaign that has been ongoing in the south that has escalated. It appears as if Hezbollah are carrying out more operations. We saw a drone attack which happened against Israeli forces. The footage hasn't been published by Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been carrying out these attacks, but Israel has also just been covering up and putting military censor on it. So the FPV drone strike that occurred in Lebanon, there was no news about the latest one that just happened. There have been a number of others as well that targeted military vehicles, an IED attack last week as well. So a lot has been sort of happening, but it does look like the pace of the bombings in Lebanon, because it has been accelerating, that could cause Hezbollah to start to react again. And that will likely mean that Hezbollah will be publishing a lot of the videos of them attacking the Israelis. And so we will, of course, follow that and stay on top of all those developments as well. If you want to continue to get those live updates, make sure to join the Mint Press Telegram and our X account, where we have those more immediate live updates for the developing news. So until next time, people, we will be back here on Thursday, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your days or nights.